I think we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning for our Civil Asset Forfeiture Forum, or as we like to call it at the Goldwater Institute, How the Government Steals Your Money. My name is Victor Riches, and I'm joined today by Paul Avalar. And for those of you who may not know Paul, he is the managing attorney for the Arizona office of Institute for Justice. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Paul and the Institute have been tremendous allies of the Goldwater Institute for many, many years, and we are and Paul himself has been deeply involved in the fight against unjust takings. So we're very lucky to have Paul here with us today. And Paul, I just want to start by just saying that I think that to the extent most people understand civil asset forfeiture laws, I think they probably think about the RICO statutes. Which, as many of you probably know, started in the 1970s, and they were designed to go after the mafia and other organized crime. But Paul, as you and I were discussing the other day, the reality is that the government seizing of property goes back much, much further than that, all the way to maritime laws. And so, Paul, my first question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about the origins of asset forfeiture? And what does civil asset forfeiture actually mean today?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to see you again. Great to be back with the Goldwater Institute. Great to be working with you guys on reforms here in Arizona and everywhere else. Forfeiture really started as a way of fighting piracy on the high seas. The idea was that if you caught someone who was smuggling contraband goods or was engaged in piracy, you could seize the ship that was being used and tow it to the nearest court, and there would be a proceeding against the boat to determine whether the boat was guilty of piracy. And a lot of that history is debated somewhat. Justice Thomas, for example, has some particular views about what was going on then. But the upshot was that really was what forfeiture was limited to. It's not limited to that anymore. In the 1980s, during the height of the war on drugs, the Reagan administration discovered forfeiture and said, you know what, that's something that we can use to fight the drug cartels. And so civil forfeiture, as we know it in the US today, really only traces back to about the mid-80s. And the federal government started that program, and as is often the case, the states, including Arizona, followed suit. And we have seen since then just a massive, massive growth in forfeiture. And now, thanks to a lot of data that has come out that the result of reforms that our organizations and others have pushed for, we now have a lot better picture of what's happening with forfeiture. And it's certainly not the system that we were originally told it would be.
Well, I think that's it's a point that's definitely worth following up on, because it is pretty astonishing that something that was originally designed to go after pirates, and then in the 70s and 80s they decided to go after organized crime and mobsters. But who's it really going after today? Are we talking about, by and large, these giant crime syndicates, or are we talking about average people?
We're talking much more like average people. Again, because of some of the reporting reforms we've got, we know that in Arizona, for example, the median, that is the middle cash seizure number in Arizona, cash forfeiture number in Arizona, is $1,000. Half of all cash forfeitures in Arizona are less than $1,000 or less. That's not the big cartels. That's the best that it is sort of everyday type of criminal activity. And because civil forfeiture doesn't even require a criminal conviction or even criminal charges, we can't even say that those are forfeitures from criminals. They're just, we're taking property from people, and we have no reason to believe that they've actually committed the crime yet. as our Constitution requires that showing, which is a criminal trial with a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. None of that exists in civil forfeiture.
So what are the average dollar amounts that we're talking about? And I guess in addition to that, it's probably worth explaining a little bit to our viewers when we're talking about civil asset forfeiture. What does that even look like? What are they taking? Are they taking cars? Are they taking cash? Are they taking real estate? What does that look like, and what does that average amount actually turn out to be?
So the answer to that is they're taking everything. The way civil forfeiture works is the government can take and keep property that they allege is the going to be used to commit a crime, was used to commit a crime, or is the proceeds of a crime. And again, they don't actually have to show that the owner of the property committed a crime. What they have to show is that the property is somehow linked to the crime. And so in Arizona, as in most places, cash, homes, cars, sometimes weapons, and sometimes some really weird things. We've seen forfeitures of Halloween costumes. I have no idea how the Halloween costumes were linked to the commission of a crime, but they were forfeited. In Arizona, based on the numbers that we've seen, almost half of everything forfeited in Arizona is cash. There's a goodly number of vehicles that are also subject to forfeiture, a very small amount of real property, and other things like weapons. If you look at the federal forfeiture system, it's a little bit different, a lot more weapons there, a lot more real estate there, as a percentage less cash, but the federal program is massive. And so it's a little bit of everything. And the key aspect of all of this is it's civil forfeiture, and people don't always quite understand what that means, and it's important for folks to have an understanding of what that does mean in terms of process.
Yeah, and that was going to be my next question to you. There's a very important reason, certainly from the government's perspective, on why civil asset forfeiture is perhaps preferable to criminal forfeiture. Can you explain to folks why that would be? Why they tend to gravitate so heavily towards civil asset forfeiture when, frankly, criminal forfeiture probably would sound a little bit more reasonable to most people.
Right. So criminal forfeiture, when we talk about it, is forfeiture that happens at the conclusion of a criminal case where there's been a conviction in that case, and then as part of the they call ancillary proceedings, there's a forfeit. There's something that can be done with forfeiture. And as anyone who knows basic civics in the U.S., or maybe even has seen at too many episodes of Law and Order, in the criminal world, if police think you committed a crime, they can arrest you. They have to take you before a judge. You are entitled to a trial by jury. You are allowed to have a lawyer, and if you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. And you have to be convicted by a unanimous jury beyond a reasonable doubt. These are all due process protections that are baked into our criminal system.
And I think that's the way most people think the system works, but it doesn't necessarily work that way.
Take everything I just said and flip it over entirely. In civil forfeiture, if the police think that your property is connected to a crime, they can seize it, and the government can move to take it from you forever. And the proceeding in which that happens, you don't have a right to a jury, at least not in most places. You can, if you can afford a lawyer, great, but if you can't afford a lawyer, too bad. And most people we know can't afford a lawyer, or reasonably don't hire a lawyer because the amounts at issue are so small that it actually costs more to hire a lawyer. And what's really galling about the entire system is that the government doesn't have to prove that you committed a crime beyond a reasonable doubt. They just have to prove usually to much lesser showing, that the property was involved with the crime. And if you claim to be innocent, in most systems, including both in Arizona and the federal system, you have to prove your own innocence. Otherwise, the government can take your property. And to put just a horrible sort of final, adding injury to injury in this case, in most systems, including Arizona's, the government gets to keep 100% of whatever it forfeits. The cash that they're taking from you, they get to keep. Law enforcement itself gets to keep. It's put into a special account that really only law enforcement can use and use for themselves. And so it creates this horrible incentive, and we know that incentives matter, for profit. Policing for profit is not just a cute name, it's what's happening. Because we know that when times get tough, forfeiture steps up, and then they get to use that money to plow back into their own budgets that they control and that are independent of the legislature's power of the purse. That's troubling for just a whole host of reasons.
For sure. We're getting a few questions from folks that are asking about, they're under the impression that civil asset forfeiture laws were illegal in Arizona. And I do want to stress to folks, no, they are not illegal in Arizona. Now we are running legislation to combat some significant problems with those laws, and we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. And IJ is also involved in an extensive amount of efforts on how to roll back some of these laws. But this does bring up a point that I hear from people all the time, and it is, how are these things not unconstitutional? We have a Fourth Amendment to the Constitution. We have a Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. How is it that these laws even withstand constitutional scrutiny?
So there has been this legal fiction that a forfeiture case isn't against you, it's against your property. And you have rights, but your property doesn't. That's why these forfeiture cases have all of these wonky names, like, state of Arizona versus, 2014 Dodge Ram, or state of Arizona versus $32,000 in U.S. currency, or the United States of America versus, there's a famous one where it's 50,000 boxes more or less, each one containing one set of clacker balls. There's all these weird case names out there, and that's because the legal fiction is the lawsuit, the case is against the property. And so that's what's happened. And over the years, the U.S. Supreme Court has upheld these things. I think there are members of the court right now that are rethinking it, that have come to realize that there are a number of abuses that they didn't know about or didn't appreciate at the time, or maybe they got their history wrong. But as of now, forfeiture is constitutional because the courts say it's so. It shouldn't be, but it is, and that's what we're working on.
So the sad thing is, if I can, that may be being overly simplistic here, but in our country, people are innocent until proven guilty, but property is guilty until proven innocent.
That's the way the system works, and it has been allowed to work.
Does the property? I saw one of our listeners send in a question asking, does the property have to be located within the state? So if it's a state situation, if it's a state government entity that's going after this person, does that property have to be located here, or can they seize property from anywhere?
They can seize property from anywhere. There are laws that allow them to seize property for alleged criminal activity that didn't occur in Arizona, but they can also reach out of state to grab property that they allege is subject to forfeiture. So there's not really this constraint on it.
And you touched on this a few minutes back, but I think this is something really worth driving home to folks. And it's this, that one of the things I think we both find so phenomenally disturbing about these forfeiture laws is that they really do create a very perverse profit motive to the government. And I can say, as a guy that spent many years working out at the Capitol, primarily working on the state budgets and the other economic issues out there, the way the process usually works, and the way the process should work in my mind, is that if you're a government entity and you have a funding proposal, you have an idea, you should take that proposal, whether it's to the legislature or to the city council, whatever the appropriate body is, and frankly, that funding proposal should have to compete with other funding proposals, and let the elected officials make the determination on which projects ultimately come to fruition. And what we're of course seeing here is with some of these government entities, they're sort of skipping over that budget process, and instead they're just taking private citizens' property as a way of filling in budget gaps. And one of the things that I've noticed, Paul, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, is that it's now starting to appear, and it's probably been going on for a while, that you have these particularly law enforcement entities that are actually budgeting in their budget. So just for the viewers out there, normally they take a budget and they propose it to the legislature, and the budget just lists out, here's the dollars that we need, or that we want, and that is what we are requesting. Now we're seeing budget line items that say asset forfeiture. Mm-hmm. So in other words, we've got $5 million line item here. That means we have to confiscate $5 million of property. And that just seems like it creates a phenomenally perverse incentive to make sure you meet that budget item and make sure that you confiscate that dollar amount. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what you guys are seeing.
Sure. So let's talk about some of the numbers first, and then we can talk about where that money goes and how it works. So in Arizona, we have some good data going back to about 2000 about how much money is working through the state system. Now, that's not all of the money. There's also federal forfeiture programs that the state can partake in as well, and there's more money there. But through the state system alone, it's more than $500 million between fiscal year 2000 and 2019. $530 million just through the state system. Fiscal year 2019, the last year that we have full data available for, was $24 million. That is $24 million into law enforcement coffers. What do I mean by that? Forfeiture funds in Arizona have to be deposited into something called a anti-racketeering revolving account. It just rolls off the top. They're called RICO accounts. And these are accounts that exist at the state level and then in each county. And money is deposited there and held for the sole benefit of the entities that were involved in the forfeiture itself. So if DPS seizes property and it gets forfeited, that money goes into the DPS account at the state level. The Attorney General's account, or the Attorney General gets a part of that at the county levels. Each county does it a little bit differently. Some have pooled accounts, some have individual accounts. But the key point here is that money is in the account. Only law enforcement gets to control how it's spent and what it's spent on. And what are they spending it on? Well, the last 2 years we have data for, almost 3/4 of all of that spending was on salaries and on equipment. That's not what you hear, but that's where the money went. Follow the money, that's where it went. Only about 3% of that money went to what they call community accounts or efforts to combat drug use or gangs or what have you. And you also hear a lot about, well, we help victims with this money. 1/3 of 1% of that money was spent on victim services. That's it. You're talking about massive amounts of spending just on the law enforcement entities itself. And this creates, as you said, a huge problem where law enforcement agencies can go around the legislature to get what they want. There's a story out of, I think, Green Valley a couple of years ago where the police force really wanted an armored personnel carrier. But the Green Valley City Council said no. They bought it anyway because they could use forfeiture funds to do that. For many years ago, the Attorney General's office was funding, I think, 50 or 49 full-time employment positions. That is, they're funding like 50 people in their office whose salary is coming straight from forfeiture. And that creates exactly the huge problem that you mentioned because, well, now we got to make budget. We got to make that money so that we can keep paying our people. And that's the profit incentive that we're worried about. And then when forfeiture funds dipped, all of a sudden the Attorney General's office started running a structural deficit. They actually had to go to the legislature a couple of years ago for a bailout to fund some of these positions. As a part of that, there was finally some restrictions put on how many people they could fund, but that funding mechanism is still there. The pending reforms get at that, but that's something that happens not just at the AG's office. We just have the best data there. but we know it's happening elsewhere as well, and that is a problem.
Well, yeah. In fact, there's been some real scandals particularly out of southern Arizona, with some of the sheriff's offices where they've been using these civil asset dollars, these RICO funds, for things that I think most taxpayers would find deeply offensive. One of the questions, Paul, and I think you've answered this quite well, but I just really want to reiterate this. They're asking, do these dollars end up in the general fund? And the answer is no. Now, I think if they did end up in the general fund, as much as I would still find this program to be quite offensive, at least that profit motive component would be eliminated. But the fact that they go into this revolving fund that is set aside specifically for those entities, it really does create that very perverse profit.
Arizona law says it has to go there, and under the federal program, these what they call equitable sharing program, where the feds can do some forfeitures for the state entities and then give them like an 80% kickback. The federal rules are actually that the funds have to be only directed and used by the law enforcement agencies. It is illegal under the federal program to send that money to anyone other than the law enforcement. It can't go to the general fund. So that's another big problem. And some states that have reformed their laws, states like Missouri and a couple of other places like that, saw a massive uptick in the use of the federal program because it allowed the law enforcement agencies involved to continue keeping the cash, keeping the money that they were getting. They were bypassing state law that they were supposed to be enforcing and abiding by running to the feds to do their dirty work for them.
How does it work when they go after corporations? Is that treated the same as individuals? Is it still civil asset forfeiture, or do they use criminal forfeiture?
So corporations are no different than individuals. It can be used civilly, it can be used criminally. We have some numbers on that. In Arizona, at least 93% of all forfeitures are civil, not criminal. In the federal system, I think it's upwards of 85% at least are civil, not criminal. But individuals, corporations, it doesn't matter. It's all subject to the same set of rules in terms of you don't need to be convicted of a crime, and if you claim innocence, you probably have to prove your own innocence in order to keep your stuff.
Can you tell us a little bit about just the demography of the average victim of civil asset forfeiture? We've sort of touched around this a little bit. We know that they're generally not really being used against large criminal organizations or human trafficking organizations or that sort of thing. What does the usual demography of folks look like? And I'll just say from the work that we've been doing at Goldwater on civil asset forfeiture, and the handful of clients that we've started representing just in the last few months, they've all been very low income individuals, oftentimes people of color. What are you guys seeing historically? Largely the same.
I mean, again, when you look at the numbers, what is the median cash forfeiture of cash in Arizona? It's $1,000 or less. These are small cases, and when you figure how much does it cost to hire an attorney? Lots of attorneys, I know a lot of attorneys who work in this sphere. Generally, the first thing an attorney, if you contact an attorney, they'll say, well, how much is your car worth? How much really did they take from you? And almost invariably, the second thing they say is, it's going to cost you more to hire me. Economically rationally, your best bet is just to give up and just cut your losses. Even if you've done nothing wrong, it just makes the most sense to cut your losses. And so when you've got a whole bunch of these small forfeitures, you're really, frankly, picking on people who can't afford to fight back. And that's a real problem.
I think that is probably begs the question of what does the process really look like for people? So if your property has been taken from the government, you're now in the situation of trying to get your property back. How does that look? Because one of the concerns that I've had is it does seem like it's heavily placed in the direction of making it very, very difficult for you to even get that property back once it's been taken from you.
There is a thumb on the scale in favor of the government from day one. So the typical forfeiture starts with the seizure. And generally it's a warrantless seizure. We've seen lots of these where the police pull you over for some egregious violation of the law, like a window tint violation. And then they search your car and they find some money. Doesn't have to be a lot of money, they find it. And they seize it. If they've seized it for forfeiture, they have 60 days to essentially notify everyone who might have an interest in it, hey, we're going to try and forfeit this. And then at that point, you have just 30 days to contest the forfeiture by filing. And this is the best case, this is the best case scenario. As with all things in the law, it's complicated and it depends, and that's the reason why people are lawyers. Lots of times what we're seeing is police seize stuff that has no evidentiary value. It's clear they're seizing it for forfeiture, but they don't say they're seizing it for forfeiture. And that allows them to just keep the clock running. The deadlines don't start until they say we've started the deadlines. And that's a real problem. In Arizona, there's also a system called uncontested forfeiture, which is really a misnomer. It's administrative forfeiture. It's a process by which the prosecutor involved in the case can decide whether or not to do the forfeiture or not. And it sets a real procedural trap for the unwary. I've been litigating about this issue out of Navajo County for 4 years now, about the way that system works. And again, the pending legislation gets rid of that system finally, but there's still administrative forfeiture at the federal level. In some ways it's even worse than Arizona's system. So you've got all these other problems, but ideally, they follow the 60 days, you've got 30 days to file a notice of claim, which is, that's my property, here's my proof of ownership, here's lots of other information. If you don't make that 30 days, you're out. You can't contest anymore, and there's no extensions, there's no nothing. You miss that 30-day window, you are done. And the government just gets to keep your stuff. If you file a claim, then the government's supposed to have another 60 days to file a complaint. Well, I don't know if you've been counting, but we're now at 150, we're now at nearly 6 months that you don't have your property. The government can drag this out. If they file a complaint, then you're into ordinary litigation, and that never goes quickly at all either. And I understand why people dislike lawyers. So you've got to file an answer, and then you've got to do discovery, and then you get a hearing, ideally. But you don't get a jury, not in Arizona. And at this proceeding, the government has to show clear and convincing evidence in Arizona that the property is connected to a crime. And if you can claim an innocent ownership, you have to prove your own innocence. And then the judge makes a decision. Now, ideally, you get there. We know, however, that in Arizona, lots of these cases are never contested. And even the ones that are contested, last numbers I saw, it's only like 20% of people have a lawyer in one of these cases. And so that really puts property owners behind the 8 ball in terms of their ability to fight back. In 2017, we made a lot of good reforms. The system I just described used to be even worse, and we got some good reforms in 2017, but that's still a system that exists in place right now today.
We've gotten a couple of questions from folks talking about that the forfeiture laws themselves are not wrong. It's more a matter of, are there things that can be done to sort of rein in some of these law enforcement organizations getting out of control? Are there steps to go in that direction, or at the end of the day, is it just that forfeiture is a process that whose time has sort of come and gone in terms of being an effective tool for?
So the question is, what kind of forfeiture? I don't think I'm saying anything crazy here when I say, look, I don't think that people should be able to profit from committing crimes. But in this country, we have a very specific way of determining if you've committed a crime. That's a criminal proceeding. That is why, at IJ, we've really been pushing the idea of adopting reforms like New Mexico did just 5-6 years ago, where they eliminated civil forfeiture and they went entirely to a criminal forfeiture proceeding. So there's still forfeiture in New Mexico, but it's criminal. What are the key differences? It comes at the end of a criminal proceeding when someone has had the full slate of due process protections for their liberty and their property that we have. And the other major thing that New Mexico did was they ended the profit incentive. In New Mexico, forfeiture proceeds at the end of a case gets deposited in the general fund, where the legislature gets to exercise the power of the purse. So New Mexico has done two fantastic things in that respect. And they did it long enough ago now that we've begun to study it. And so in the two most recent reports that we've published on forfeiture, Policing for Profit, the third edition, which came out in December, and another report that came out earlier this month called Does Forfeiture Work? We began to look at these numbers. Was there an uptick in crime in New Mexico after these reforms went through? No, there wasn't. In the states that we can have good data on, can we link forfeiture to decreases in crime or drug use or crime clearance rates? No, we can't. What is forfeiture correlated with in those cases? Well, an uptick in forfeiture tends to come with worse economic conditions in the state, suggesting that this really is driven by a need to generate profit in some cases. And one of the more disturbing things, some of the data actually suggests that forfeiture is linked to lower crime clearance rates of violent crime. Now, why would that be? Well, we've seen in some places this profit incentive changes the way that law enforcement has its priorities. One of the clearest examples of this came many years ago from Tennessee, where there was a drug task force there sitting along I-40, and in Tennessee, I-40 is considered a drug corridor. And the theory is the drugs come from the west and go to the east. Money comes from the east and goes to the west. So this task force was doing traffic stops, looking for drug activity on I-40. 10-1, they were making stops on the westbound side. They were looking for cash. They weren't bothering to look for the drugs. They were looking for the cash because the drugs, they can't do anything with. That's contraband. They have to destroy it. Cash, they got to keep for themselves. Funding themselves doing this. And so there's this concern that this profit incentive will actually warp law enforcement priorities to doing not only forfeitures that are unjust and of innocent people, but also that it may distract them from actually going after the real criminals because there's not money.
We've got a question from one of our listeners asking if there's any pending legislation right now in Arizona, and there's legislation that we've been working on with Representative Travis Grantham. And the primary point of that legislation is that before the government can actually take a person's property, the person has to actually be convicted of a crime. And Paul, you've touched on some other really strong ideas that would be very critical to pushing back against some of these uses of civil asset forfeiture. Are there, even outside of the state level, is there perhaps a federal angle as well, or is this an issue that really best tackled at the states?
So it's both a state and a federal problem, and there's lots of work to be done at the state level, and also lots of work to be done at the federal level. At the federal level, we know that there's a lot of abuses of this equitable sharing program, and a number of things looked at on that front. One big reform a couple of years ago was the Treasury Department was seizing businesses' bank accounts based on this crime called structuring, which is there's bank reporting laws. If you deposit more than $10,000 in cash, or withdraw more than $10,000, there has to be a report. Well, there's a law that is called the anti-structuring law that says you're not allowed to structure your deposits so that you're avoiding this reporting account. And again, it was really aimed at, in the 1960s and 70s, actual like mafia families. Well, the government never actually tied that to inflation. And so today we were seeing a lot of small businesses have their entire account seized because they were just depositing their normal amounts of cash. And the government said, oh, that looks like structuring, we're taking everything. Well, if you take a small business's entire working bank account capital, they're out of business. And we were especially seeing a lot of, well, we'll give you half of it back if you agree to waive any lawsuit against them. That's just a shakedown. That reform was there was a Congress enacted some changes to that to be able to prevent that from happening. But we still have the usual sorts of problems. Now, the federal government, to its credit, I can't believe I'm actually saying that, does have some policies in place. These aren't laws, this is their own policies. So the federal government has a policy that it doesn't do forfeitures of cash that are less than $5,000. Policy, they could go and change that tomorrow. Under the Obama administration, there was a policy of not doing something called adoptive forfeiture, which really was the method that a lot of law enforcement agencies were using to get around state laws. The Obama administration curtailed that. That policy was reversed during the Trump administration. We're hoping that the current Biden administration will go back to that policy because that's the right way to do it. State officials shouldn't be trying to get around their own state laws. But there's those sorts of things. There are due process acts, and there's several bipartisan bills in Congress every year to reform parts of this system. But again, it's pretty hard to reform because the people who are involved, there's a lot of money at issue.
We've gotten a couple of notes from folks suggesting that the problem really is bad cops, not forfeiture law themselves. But the question I have for you is do the really egregious forfeitures, is that coming from the police level, or is that kind of coming higher up the food chain? In other words, is it coming from the police who are making that initial bust or quasi arrest, whatever the case might be, or is that something that's coming higher up to general food?
It's both, but the reforms that we've worked on here in Arizona have really been focused on the prosecutors. We've been careful with the way that we affect what police do. A large part of the forfeiture problem is this profit incentive, and it's driven by prosecutors who again have this. Prosecutors could send lots of forfeitures back. It's not clear that they are, and for a forfeiture to be pursued, the attorney for the state, that's the magic language, Arizona statutes, essentially has to make the decision to pursue the forfeiture. So a lot of what we've been doing is focusing on those decisions. What are the prosecutors really doing? Because whatever else you think about the police, the prosecutors have time to sit and think about these things. State law gives them at least 60 days to do it. We ought to be making sure that they're making the right decisions. We can't be sure of that, though, given this incentive, this profit incentive. It's really damaging. We can't have government officials making decisions about people's property, about their property rights, when they've got, a stake in the game, frankly.
I think that's a great point. If you took the profit incentive out, made it so there has to be some kind of criminal conviction before the property is taken, it would probably alleviate 90% of the abuses. And it's been interesting as we've been getting more involved in some lawsuits. One of the other things that we've seen is the property that's stolen, that's taken by the government, literally has no actual connection with the crime. What I mean by that is we had just in the last few months, his son was accused of selling some narcotics out of their home. The homeowner was unaware of this happening. He had actually collected a small amount of money. I believe it was less than $1,000. I think it was $500 for a charity soccer tournament. Mm-hmm. And so the police went in. They went into the son's room. took some money and items out of the sunroom. Then they checked the rest of the house and they found this $500 going to the charity soccer tournament and took that as well. Now we ultimately got that money back to the father. But is that a unique situation, or do we see that happen quite often?
It is certainly not unique, and it's far more common than anyone can be comfortable with. For many years, we have been representing a group of plaintiffs in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and the lead clients in that case, their son had a drug problem. He was living at home, had a drug problem, and sold like $50 worth of drugs to an undercover officer. And the police seized the home, his parents' home, on the grounds that, well, he was living there, therefore it was connected to a crime. And actually, the deal was the family was going to get kicked out of the house during Christmas time unless they kicked the son out of the house, who had really nowhere else to go. And we've been fighting that system in Philadelphia for a very long time. It was the same problem, which was forfeiture. Seize the house, they get to keep it if they forfeit it. And the system that they went through in Philadelphia was in some ways even worse than the system that we have currently in Arizona, where if you missed a meeting with a judge who was actually a prosecutor, you were out. You couldn't ever fight to get your property back. That has been, I think, largely resolved, although we're still fighting about some of those issues in Philadelphia. But yeah, that's not an uncommon sort of thing where you have a family member who has problems. What results in parents, grandparents, an innocent spouse or a boyfriend or a girlfriend facing the loss of their own car, house, cash, whatever.
Which you mentioned a little earlier that New Mexico has actually done very positive changes to the forfeiture laws. Of course, forfeiture still exists out there, just in a much more rational way. Are there other states that have done a good job? And I suppose on the flip side of that, which states are particularly bad at dealing with civil asset forfeiture?
So there are a number of states out there that have done well. New Mexico remains the gold standard. Everyone should try to be like New Mexico when it comes to reform of forfeiture. Montana has some good reforms as well around profit incentives, but also criminal conviction requirements and criminal forfeiture. Nebraska, New Hampshire, states like that. There's a lot of states sort of in the ugly middle, and that's where Arizona is currently. Probably the worst state out there is Massachusetts, where the police can forfeit property based solely on probable cause. Probable cause is a standard that is used for temporary deprivations of property. Probable cause to seize something because we believe it's related to evidence or something like that, but it's temporary by definition. Forfeiture is permanent, and yet the state of Massachusetts allows the permanent deprivation of property based solely on a probable cause finding. It's out of step with what everyone else has done, and it's ridiculous.
So, would it be safe to say that, from your perspective, Paul, and this would be a perspective I would share, it's not that the concept of asset forfeiture is completely wrong-headed. It's the practice of it in so many states is really what the problem is. Again, if they were limited to criminal asset forfeiture as opposed to civil asset forfeiture, make sure that there actually are people actually convicted before they lose their property, that it could actually be a legitimate law enforcement.
Again, we really want to focus on what New Mexico has done here. Criminal forfeiture with no profit incentive. That's the way to go. That's the way in which we can assure that people are not profiting by committing crimes. Good, great. But we're also respecting property rights, due process rights, those sorts of things along the way. It's when you start to introduce these shortcuts to that system that you're going to get abuses. You're going to, period. full stop. As we've seen, it doesn't. And these profit incentives are particularly dangerous because you may not even realize that you're doing the wrong thing. People get tunnel vision, including police officers, including prosecutors. They get tunnel vision sometimes. They're so convinced that what they're doing is the right thing that they sometimes miss things. And the problem with the forfeiture world is lots of people can't afford to fight back. It never really goes to a judge. That you don't get that real judicial check, rest of the government that you do in things like criminal cases and criminal. So if you can move forfeiture to a criminal only model like New Mexico did, and if you can eliminate the profit incentive like New Mexico and a couple of other states have started to do, you're going to have a better system. In fact, you're going to have the best system that we can, I think, possibly have.
And it is interesting that you made a great point. And when we're talking about due process, our protection should be afforded to everyone. And I feel like what's really happened with these civil asset forfeiture laws, handful of decades, is they've taken the notion that was never really designed to deal with 2021 problems, let alone even really 1980 problems. They were designed to deal with issues like pirates, like gangsters, that kind of thing. And it seems to be a tool that's been misused, frankly, for several years to go after a much lower level of potential offender. And again, I always like to stress to folks that oftentimes these are people, they've never even been charged with a crime.
Yeah.
They literally don't ever get charged with a crime. They're never convicted of a crime, but they still lose their property. And it does seem like having that conviction requirement, that criminal requirement, would eliminate, and of course the profit motive would eliminate.
Yeah, at the federal system, we've even seen some early proponents of forfeiture as part of fighting the war on drugs. So you know what? This is not the system that we were going for. The system has grown. It's changed. We're now doing things that the system is now doing things that it was never meant to do. It's focusing on people it was never meant to focus on. This is not the system we thought we were getting. We need to reform it. Again, from our perspective, the gold standard of reform remains what was done right next door in New Mexico, where you eliminated the profit incentive, went to a criminal forfeiture only model. And in the 5-6 years that we've been under that reform, you've not seen the parade of horribles. It's not true that crime has run rampant in New Mexico. It's true that police have been starved of necessary funds that they that hasn't happened. And it wouldn't happen here. There's no reason to believe it would happen here. We can move to that system where we can continue to fight crime, but we won't have these abuses.
Thank you, Paul, very much. We've pretty much reached the end of this teleforum. And I do want to thank everyone for joining us today. And I also want to just mention to folks that if you do learn of any cases in which you see the government taking someone else's property, feel free to let us know. Paul and the Institute for Justice and us over here at Goldwater, these are cases that we are very interested in. Please don't hesitate. Let us know when you see these types of abuses. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us and stay safe. And thank you, Paul. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.